instead of starting with the data and the metrics and then trying to create a hypothesis out of that, start with what your strategy is. What do you need to know about whether that strategy is working or failing? How can you measure that? What kind of metrics are we looking for? What kind of data are we looking for? How can we know when something goes wrong or bad or whatever else? But tie it back to the strategy. And of course, the problem is a lot of companies don't have a proper strategy, but that's where you need to start. If you have a strategy, a proper strategy, then everything else tends to follow in place naturally.
Welcome to What Gets Measured, a NinjaCat podcast about marketing, performance management, metrics, and effectiveness. Because what gets measured gets managed. I'm your host, Jake Sanders. With a career spanning over a decade, JP Castlin has carved a niche in helping organizations navigate the complexities of market dynamics and strategic planning. He is an independent consultant that aids businesses in leveraging strategic marketing and organizational capabilities to outmaneuver competition. A thought leader in the field, JP regularly shares insights on his blog and speaks at various industry events, has an amazing newsletter, Strategy in Praxis, is a gem to follow on social, and he's here today to talk about complexity and data management. JP, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Jacob, for that suspiciously terse introduction.
I had to get it out. I wrote it. I have to say it. That's the rules. Thank you for being here. I know you're busy expecting a new child, so things are kind of in a state of flux over there, maybe a little bit complex. So thank you.
Oh, it's my pleasure. I'd love to be here.
Yeah, man. All right, so let's talk about data, because I'm thinking if you have enough data, you don't have to worry about strategy because the data will tell you. So talking about intuition too, people are like, it's data driven or it's intuitive. And when the people come to intuitive things, they're like, wow, that's really cool. But no one is going to pay you. They need the data. So you talk about this intersection of data-driven decision-making and strategic intuition. I mean, like, in your opinion, like, talk about the differences in between those. And then what's your advice for companies that are like, they're overly reliant on data or they're overly reliant on intuition? Like, speak about this.
Well, I mean, it's a rather large topic to say the least, but yeah. But if you go back to, let's start at the sort of proverbial beginning and talk about complexity, right? So, the overwhelming majority of people are sort of, or rather their, I suppose, understanding of the world is that it's largely ordered, right? So it's one of probabilities. We can collect data and we can predict what's going to happen. And if we're unable to predict what's going to happen, essentially it's our fault, right?
Right.
And this feeling is rather ingrained in us in the sense that whenever we leave kindergarten, right? So we're told by our new teachers that, you know, for every test on the answer, there's a correct answer. You should know it. And if you don't, well, you should have done your homework.
Right. Then
we go to, you know, university and later MBAs and whatever it might be. And essentially you hear that same thing. We're going to our various professions, especially for strategists responsible for the success of an organization. And we're told that, you know, the truth is out there, as I said in the X-Files. And if we don't know it, if we can't find it, right, we should have just looked harder. We should have done our homework. Now, the problem is if you're dealing with something which is complex, and complex systems are systems which are highly interconnected and entangled, you're dealing with something that is not causal, it's just dispositional. What that means in more sort of colloquial terms is that essentially it's unpredictable. We can anticipate certain things. Like, for example, we can anticipate what patterns might emerge after breakthrough innovation, but we cannot predict what the specific breakthrough innovation will be. And that is regardless of how much data we collect, right? And so I'll run a very simple illustration of this. This is it's called Kaufman's screwdriver, and if you have any listeners, they can sort of play along at home, right? So imagine that you have a screwdriver in your hand, right? Now, Jacob, what can you do with a screwdriver?
Oh, well, you're drinking. Is it vodka and orange juice? Is that?
Well, yeah, but let's actually call it something you can. A tool, let's say. I mean, I suppose a screwdriver cocktail or grog could be a tool if you're looking to get hammered. But, you know, a proper screwdriver. What can you do with a screwdriver?
You can tighten screws. You could maybe loosen them.
Yeah. What else can you do?
It could be a weapon in an alley fight.
Mm-hmm.
It could leverage something. It could pop a thing, like if you need a lever.
Yeah. So, I mean, basically, you can do a bunch of things with a screwdriver, right? But would you agree that you can't do anything with a screwdriver, right? The number of use of a screwdriver isn't infinite. Would you agree with that?
Right.
But the number of uses is indefinite. In other words, we won't know what the end of, we can always come up with new use of a screwdriver, basically, right? So we know there's an end to the amount of uses, the things you can do with a screwdriver. We just don't know where that end is. Right. So it's not infinite, it's indefinite. The other thing is that when we try to list the various uses of a screwdriver, right, we can't really put them on any kind of scale other than a nominal scale. In other words, they're just different uses. They're not 2% more than this, or it's not a linear scale, anything like that. It's just a nominal scale. It's just the list of things. Now, technically speaking, these two things combined, an indefinite sample space and something you can only describe using nominal scales. That means that the number of uses of a screwdriver is non-algorithmic, right? It cannot be calculated. That's regardless of how much AI, ML, computer software, whatever information you have. It's literally impossible to calculate it. And this is what we're dealing with when we're dealing with complexity. So it's not that we do not know what will happen. It's that we literally cannot know what will happen a priori. However, having said that, if you were to take a screwdriver and we tie it to a stick, you could use it to spear fish, right? But you could also lend that or rent it out to other people. You can start a fishing spear rental business, right? Now, if that turned out to be successful, there is demand for it, then other things would emerge that we would need. We would probably need an accountant, we'd probably need salespeople, a marketing force, and so on and so forth. Those things we can anticipate, right? And this is the difference when we start talking about the behavior of a system, probabilities versus that which is inherently impossible to calculate in probabilistic terms, what is called systemic or radical uncertainty. And so when we talk about intuition versus data in strategic decision making, you have to sort of balance these things of what we can calculate because essentially it's ordered. We know a lot about the system. We can put constraints on it. We can kind of draw a proverbial line versus the stuff that we just cannot know. And the problem with a lot of traditional or conventional, I should say, theories, things like the resource-based view coming out of Jay Barney or some of the work from Porter, for example, right? It inherently assumes that not only can we look into all of our competitors at the moment, but we can look into any innovation that will happen in the future, which is a silly proposition in my view. So again, we need to balance things. And the way that we do that in reality is that we try stuff out that is small, right? So we don't want to put all of our eggs into one basket. We do parallel safety fail experimentation. We try stuff out and we collect more data, we learn more, and then we sort of accelerate as we go or scale it as we go. Now, I'm not saying you should do that with your entire business. That would be stupid, right? But you should do it for a part of your business so that you build resilience and adaptive capacity over time.
Yeah, and we're constantly being told to experiment, be innovative. Everyone should be A/B testing everything. I'm not seeing that, or I'm missing it, or something. But we are told constantly to experiment. Just take a little portion of. Are you seeing people experiment more, or what is the? Are they afraid? Is there no lab set up properly for an experimentation, or like what's going on here?
I mean, the dull answer is that it's largely dependent on. If you look at the U.S., for example, it's largely dependent on current U.S. Tax law. For example, the higher the corporate tax, or rather the lower the corporate tax, let's say, the less you tend to innovate because you just take money out of the company. But there's also currently a law in the US which basically means that you need to, whenever you do experimentation, whenever you do R&D, you have to pay it in such a way that it's very expensive. Now that's part of it. And the other problem, of course, is that people don't really know how to experiment. I know that from working with clients, teaching and doing lectures and whatever else. But I did a post on LinkedIn, I suppose depending on when this goes out, but it was early August, where basically I listed how to do, in practical terms, how we should, or companies should experiment. And the thing that a lot of people get wrong, and I think it ties back to also sort of the conventional strategic model, is that they think that experimentation essentially is a pivot, right? We have to make a big bet.
Oh.
And the reason why we're told we need to make a big bet is because we keep getting told that by people who don't have to bear the consequences of failure. And what I mean by that is, oftentimes, literally that's the case, because you're dealing with an academic who has, no actual
skin in the game, or
no, exactly, no skin in the game, right? But there's another thing as well, which is really a point about ergodicity and resilience. But if you are a client and you're working with, say, a large marketing agency or a large strategic management consultancy, right? If something goes wrong, right, you go bust. Essentially, worst case scenario, but nonetheless, you go bust. What happens to the consultancy firm or the marketing agency if that's the case? Well, they lose a client, but they have 20, 30, 40, 50, 100 more, right? So essentially, it's a difference between playing Russian roulette and playing or betting on someone who does. Either you're holding the gun or you're not, right?
Right.
And that's a completely different dynamic. So you have a lot of consultants saying, oh, we need to do the big bet, because that means if it does go wrong, they're going to earn more money, or they can use this as a cool case or whatever. But oftentimes it's just strategically stupid. So again, what you want to do instead is you have your main revenue stream, hopefully the stuff that you kind of know what to do, what David Woods would call the competence envelope. That's where you spend most of your money, your investments, your resources. That's where you can talk about efficiency and optimization and those kinds of things. You kind of know the game. And then you experiment at the edges. And again, what you want to do is you want to try stuff out, which is, it needs to be coherent to the facts of the world and your strategy and so on. But essentially, it's, to give them a few dollars, basically, right, metaphorically speaking, but very, very small amounts. And then if it shows promise, you give it a bit more money. And then if it shows more promise, you give it a bit more and bit more and bit more and so on. And you scale over time, as opposed to giving someone a huge sack of money going, yeah, let's not screw this up. And the problem with that organization are doing is they're doing the latter, which is why they're reluctant to experiment when you have sort of for example, the kind of economic climate that you have at the moment.
Right. And it's odd because advertising agencies are like, we're on the edge. We're next gen. We're like in tomorrow. We're at the intersection of tomorrow and 2 weeks from now, and is that exciting to clients? I mean, it sounds like, thinking of this sort of where they're realizing this corporate tax thing, these laws, these things in the competence envelope. They don't want to be super edgy. I mean, are agencies doing themselves a favor by talking like edgelords, or do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I know exactly what you mean. I mean, I suppose it depends on the client to a certain extent, but broadly speaking, having worked with the marketing agencies and essentially teaching them how to do things like, interpret an annual report and whatever else.
Key.
Because maybe that should be noted. I mean, these days, yes, I'm a strategy consultant, strategic management consultant. But I mean, going back all the way back, my career began as a corporate lawyer, working in mergers and acquisitions and corporate finance, those kinds of things. Wow. But no, I mean, it's a very, very basic illustration of this is a sort of example that I've used a gazillion times over the course of my career. It's a very simple explanation, but it kind of illustrates the point, right? So imagine that we have two kinds of companies. And by the way, this is an actual real life example. I've just removed all the various names. So imagine that there are two companies. They're called, let's call them Company A and Company B. We're being very creative here, but nonetheless.
I was just saying, good branding. Keep going.
Yeah, exactly, right. Now, on the face of it, these companies are more or less the same, right? They have the same kind of brand, if you want to call it that, the same kind of revenue, the same kind of size. They both make the same kind of product. They make aluminum cans. And again, they look kind of the same. Now, the question is, okay, so if you're a marketing agency and you go into this, right, so how would you market these two companies? Now, if we're being brutally honest, most marketers today, or at least a lot of them, would just skip strategy and go straight into comms, right? Start talking about social media or AI these days or whatever.
Yeah.
right? That's a bit inane, but nonetheless, right? So let's take those, put those to the side, right? They'll go sit in a corner or stare at the wall or something. And we take the quote unquote serious marketers. Well, what they would probably do is they would sort of, try to segment the market, and then they do some targeting, some positioning, and then off we go. But essentially, it's the same kind of marketing strategic process for both of these companies. Right? Now, if we actually start looking at how these companies make money, you realize that they're kind of polar opposites. So one of them has large clients, thus therefore big shipments. That means that they have high economies of scale, great economies of scale, in fact, and that means that they can actually push their prices quite low. But on the other hand, their time to market is quite long. They're quite slow. Now, the other company, again, it's polar opposite. It's many clients, but small ones. They cannot enjoy scales of economy, or economies of scales rather. And so therefore, they have to keep their prices quite high. But on the other hand, their time to market is really fast, so they can be more adaptive. Right. Now, if you're marketing for company A and you go after the kind of customer that company B has, it might be that the size of the order that you get in essentially is just too small, right? So you cannot enjoy your economies of scale, and therefore you're going to hurt your margins, and long term you're going to lose your profitability. So it's kind of a pointless endeavor. If you're working for company B and you can go after the kind of customer the company A has, it might be that the size of the order conversion is just too big. Right. So effectively what you've done is you've created a demand for which you have no supply. So you've just wasted your money, right? And this is a very basic example, but it illustrates the need to understand the business model of your client if you're working for a client, or of your company if you're working for a company. If you don't understand how these companies make money, well, guess what? You're going to have a hard time making them money. Quote bomb.
It's hard out here. One, JP, we are just marketers, mere humans. But honestly, I do see that a lot of folks don't understand the actual way their clients, or if they're in-house, their businesses make money. Does that seem weird to you?
No, I mean, I think it's long overdue that they start understanding the business, the client business. But then again, I mean, I have nightmare examples from the world of strategic management as well. I mean, I'll give you one, right? So earlier this summer, I was just out working in the garden. I started talking to a neighbor, and it turns out that he used to work for a glue manufacturing company, right? Really sexy industry, but nonetheless, that's what she did. Yeah. And back in the I think it was the 1990s thereabouts, which is sort of in ancient times for a lot of modern marketers, but nonetheless, those were
yeah, exactly.
So they created a two-component glue, right? So you have essentially a primer and a sealer, right? Right, and so, but they were sort of, because of the financial times and the global economy, they were hurting a bit. So they brought in, I can't remember what outfit it was, but it was one of the big consultancy agencies or consultancy outfits, right? And the easiest lever to pull if you're trying to create profitability, if you know absolutely 3/5 of fuck all about strategy or business strategy, is essentially you cut costs. That's what you do. You just start cutting costs. Right. And what this genius of a consultancy outfit decided to do was to essentially just cut manufacturing of the sealer. So they just did the primer, right? Now, the problem, of course, is that if you just do the primer, the glue won't work unless you buy a competitor's product. But of course, none of their competitors produced just the sealer. They just do both of them, because why the hell would you buy just the one? And this went on for a bit, and it wasn't until the entire product was sort of finished and sort of introduced to the rest of the company that someone sort of raised their hand and went, yeah, we can't sell this. And so even those guys and girls do struggle with business strategy fundamentals or corporate finance fundamentals. But then again, that kind of comes with the territory if you have a senior pitch team and a junior delivery team. No offense to anyone involved.
Well, and how many months, later after all this, how many hundreds of thousands of dollars, how many like weird meetings were like, well, what are we? It just seems there is a lot of complexity, but transparency, like
Yeah.
keeping people abreast of where they can find information if they have questions, having like knowledge management. I've also kind of seen like, oh man, there are only a couple people that like to be the librarian,
Yeah.
and those people are essential, especially around data management. So I want to get back to this data management, talking about
Yeah.
like where you find this information, where you get the data, how do you know it's good? Like, just give me an idea of data management and its role and complexity, and then talk to me about what you think a future might look like, because it might look like the past. You're the guy.
Mm.
So wrap on data, strategy,
Yeah.
future.
One thing that is important to note in terms of data and complexity is that complex systems have something called emergence. And emergence is most easily described as the fact that you have different layers of information, or scales of information, right? And the problem is that one does not predict the other, nor does it really describe the other. And if I were to take a simple illustration of this, if we take the question, what does it mean for something to be a liquid, right? That's a question that can only be asked at a certain level of emergence, right? We cannot just look at hydrogen, oxygen atoms and think, okay, so how many of these do I need to create a liquid, or the properties of a liquid? Another example, sort of a simple illustration from, I suppose, the world of companies, is that if we just observe the behavior of our employees, that won't really tell us anything about what the company as a whole is doing, right? Any more that the individual, the behavior of an individual ant would tell us about the behavior of the colony as a whole. And so when we're looking at these complex systems, what we can see essentially in terms of data is that the system has one behavior, and all of the other parts of the system has different behaviors. They have different behaviors. So the system is not the sum of the individual behaviors or the sum of the parts. It's something completely different. That means you can't go from the small to the large, or the large to the small. Okay, so what does this mean for marketing, for example? Well, if you've read a book called How Brands Grow by Byron Sharp, which was published some 14 years ago, what it tells us, and by the way, it's a sort of a practical note, this has been the case in every single client I've ever worked with once you've sort of looked at the data. What it tells us is that if you look at customer bases, your buyers, they follow what's called negative binomial distribution. So it looks like a banana, right? You have a few people who buy you a lot, you have a lot of people who buy you a little, and then most people don't buy you at all. If you're looking at that level of description of a customer base, that can tell you quite a bit, but it doesn't tell you anything about what any individual customer is doing at that precise moment, right? Because talking about complexity, if someone decides to buy your product or not buy your product, it might be because they happen to meet a friend, and the friend was going into the store, and this friend said, oh, by the way, this is a nice candy bar, or whatever. Or they didn't choose to buy your car that day because it happened that their mom was sick and needed you to go to the store to buy soup, and that ended up buying this can of soup, or how it goes. There's so many things that go into a purchase decision.
Right.
It is complex. So we need to differentiate between those two. Now, if you want to talk about data management, how we use data in our decision making, well, you have to start figuring out what level am I looking at, and am I using a proxy? Am I looking at a lagging indicator, leading indicator? How well can I test this? And depending on the activity, well, you're going to be more or less reliant on data. If you're using experimentation and you're looking at complexity, you're going to have to try a lot of stuff out. If you're doing media planning, well, a lot of that you can use econometric modeling, for example, to try and test and keep track of, and so on and so forth. So again, you need to figure out where you sit or what level you're looking at. In terms of the future, I mean, it's inherent to the system. We might get smarter or better at it. I think there's a danger of assuming that AI will solve all of those problems, because, as I mentioned in the beginning, we're dealing with something which is non-algorithmic. We're talking about complexity.
Right.
But I think at the end of the day, and again, hope I'm not offending anyone, but there are a lot of marketers who don't know how to create a negative binomial distribution curve, who don't know how to use Excel properly, who don't know how to use data. And if you have an enabler like AI, well, guess what? It's going to make your job easier. But there's a danger of becoming over-reliant on these kinds of tools. There's also a danger with So complex systems have something, they have one kind of behavior, they have a bunch of behaviors, but one of them is it follows something called the law of stretched systems. And what it means is that essentially any time which is freed up, for example, by having an AI do your work for you, is going to be filled with something else because other agents adapt to it. And what this tends to equate to for a lot of companies that I work with is that you have all these productivity apps, and then people spend more time on the productivity apps than actually being productive. Right?
My Slack is dinging right now, JP. Hold on.
Yeah, exactly that. Right? So that's a bit of a problem.
It's a huge problem. I mean, but I have a very cursory kind of riding my bike around the neighborhood understanding of statistics and math, but I'm still very interested in learning more, learning how I can counter my intuition or inform it a little bit better, learning about statistics. I mean, and they aren't statistical mathy questions. You have to ask like raw, like feeling questions, like what does this data mean? Who is it referring to? And what you just said, the level, like, I mean, am I at the oxygen atom level, or are we at the system, water, kind of like up there? That is genius. And I swear to bejesus, people are not thinking like that. Yeah. Why aren't they thinking like that? Do they feel like a lot of that is like, oh, well, this thing does the thinking for me? I mean, it's not AI, it's platforms, it's, the dashboards. I mean,
well, I mean, it's what people have always been taught to think. If you go back, if you talk about statistics, right, this tends to, you go into conversations about risk management and uncertainty management and those kinds of things. But if you go back through history, at least if you're looking at the early 1900s, right, you have things like what is technically speaking called aleatoric uncertainty. So aleatoric, essentially, it means dice in Latin, right? So maybe you've heard of the expression alia jacta est, which basically means the dice is cast, which is what Caesar said when he crossed the river Rubicon. But essentially, it's like uncertainty and probability, which is kind of like throwing a dice. And what it basically allows you won't be able to, if you're throwing a dice or a bunch of dice, right? It won't tell you what's going to come up, but you can model it and you can predict it. Right? So we know that the odds of something happening is something else and so on. So then you have something called epistemic uncertainty. Epistemic uncertainty basically means that there's an uncertainty in the model itself. But ultimately, it can be solved by collecting more data. We learn more about what we're trying to predict. So in these two kinds of uncertainty, which is what people tend to think of when they talk about uncertainty, when they talk about risk management, when you talk about probabilities and strategy and maybe it might be engineering or seawall defenses, for example, right? What they tend to do is they look at these things and ultimately the uncertainty is unsolvable. The problem is that there's a third kind of uncertainty, which is called a radical uncertainty. And that's when you're dealing with something which is inherently unknowable. I mentioned the screwdrivers earlier, right? Essentially, it's that. And what tends to happen is when we're dealing with this third kind of uncertainty, the other stuff just doesn't work there. A very good example of this is in early 2002, I think it was, Citigroup, they were looking at currency fluctuations. And as one does, right? And
endlessly.
Exactly. And what they discovered was that the deviations were so large compared to the norm that statistically speaking, they shouldn't have happened if they had been trading since the Big Bang 15 billion years ago. And you think, well, okay, this sounds highly unlikely, right? Well, yeah, it was. It was more than highly unlikely, but nonetheless, it happened.
Right.
Fast forward a few years later in 2007, and JP Morgan's CFO, I think it was looking at figures in the U.S. housing market, and they saw deviations that were greater still. In other words, it wouldn't have been sufficient if we'd gone back to the Big Bang. They still shouldn't have seen this. And the problem is that the stuff that we think is unlikely is a lot likelier than we think, because you're looking at something which is, it's not one thing happening after another. It's not sequential. You're looking at a bunch of stuff happening simultaneously. And that means that a lot of the stuff that we predict or sort of when we look at probabilities or statistics or whatever that we think is unlikely to happen actually is a lot likelier. The problem with stuff that has never happened before is that they happen all the time, right? And so this again ties back to this point about intuition versus data. Data helps a lot, especially if you're trying to understand something. The more we can learn about the system, great. But there's also a sort of problem with accuracy versus precision. The more precise we get, oftentimes less accurate we get. So you need to balance those things.
Well, it's so tough because people want those sure bets. But you said something really interesting earlier where, it was like, unless you can create a use case for this indefinite use case thing and then control those constraints, then you're starting to create demand and supply, but it's not a natural thing. Like, it seems sort of unnatural. So, but it seems like if you really, really, really wanted to navigate the future unknown, you would do whatever you could to make that future show up. I mean, isn't that kind of like what people are thinking? But you just said, like, yo, if you think this is unlikely, it's gonna happen. Like, is there some kind of weird thing, or like people, what's going on?
I mean, the simple answer, I suppose, is to look for simple answers. And I don't mean that in the terms of, simplistic advice you might get on LinkedIn, from the amateur hour.
Right.
But what I mean is, if we can find heuristics about how systems behave, about how markets behave or customers, whatever, then those are a great start. Actually, if you look at, for example, GDP growth forecasts, I can't remember whether they still do, but the U.S. Financial Department used to have an annual contest in which basically they invited a bunch of people to try to predict what was going to happen to the U.S. GDP. And obviously, these people have some of the most sophisticated models anywhere. Supercomputers, if there's out there, they can get it.
Right.
And yet, the single most accurate model for how the GDP behaves in the U.S. and anywhere else, for that matter, is the very naive statement which can be written in essentially one line in a Word document, which is, what happened in the last quarter is probably what's going to happen in the next quarter. Right? That's it. That keeps winning. It hasn't been beat. And the point that I'm trying to make is, if we can find rules of thumb, those are usually a great start. And then we can try stuff out and we can see whether that's true or whether other things predict it or so on and so forth. But it's a good start. The other thing I would say is always a good start is, instead of starting with the data and the metrics and then trying to create a hypothesis out of that, start with what your strategy is. What do you need to know about whether that strategy is working or failing? How can you measure that? What kind of metrics are we looking for? What kind of data are we looking for? How can we know when something goes wrong or bad or whatever else? But tied back to the strategy. And of course, the problem is a lot of companies don't have a proper strategy, but that's where you need to start. If you have a proper strategy, then everything else tends to follow in place naturally.
Right.
But again, if you start with data just because you have a Google telling you to invest in AI because they have, then you're going to have a bit of an issue, because you're going to have a really hard time separating signal from noise.
Yeah, and that's the main goal. I mean, just knowing what to pay. Discernment is. I don't think intelligence is on the map. I think discernment. But you do have to have a measure of intelligence to get there. But man, tell me what matters and what doesn't, because the majority of it don't. I want to talk. Give me an example of, like, JP. You walk in the door for a client and you're like, this is a strategic mess, and then how, like, can you give me a Cinderella story of somebody that you worked with or something that you've seen? You've given us a lot of great examples, but I just want something from your experience of a Cinderella story where everything went great.
I'll give you a Cinderella story, and I'll give you a horror story.
Okay,
good. With a horror story. Right?
Oh, perfect.
So one of my all-time favorite questions is, what is strategy? What does it mean, right? And I know what it means because I've done this for a fair while. Yeah. I've written about it. I'm literally writing a book about it at the moment. I've written ebook stuff about it. So I know what people tend to say on a broad scale. Right. Now, I asked that question working with a U.S. marketing agency. I had essentially their seniors and above, let's say, in a room, and I said, okay, so what's strategy? And no one knew. No one could answer. Like, it's not that people didn't know, because there could be right or wrong answers, but matter of opinions. But they just didn't have an answer at all. And I said, okay, so we can't agree on what a strategy is or really come up with any proper suggestions. Okay, but you do strategy for clients, right? Because that's what they did. They did strategy. And I said, okay, but how do you know if a strategy, speaking of data, if whether it succeeds or fails?
Right.
Again, no answer. And I go, okay, what do you do for clients? And of course, what they did for clients was a lot of agencies do, unfortunately, which is to say that they create the strategy for their clients, they hand off the document, and then that's it. Their job is done. They have no idea whether that thing is ever executed. I'll give you a spoiler. It usually isn't. It tends to collect dust in a drawer somewhere. But they have no idea whether it works, whether it doesn't work, if it's a huge success or a large failure. They just collect their paycheck and off they go.
Right.
And I can tell you, for anyone listening, usually what tends to happen with any strategy is that the strategy works because the people who are tasked with executing it kind of work around all the flaws with it. That's usually the case.
Right.
But anyway, so that was, again, I was working with agency. They sell strategy to clients, didn't know what a strategy was, nor what really made one tick or work.
Woof.
Yeah, exactly right. But if we talk about Cinderella stories, I was working with a client that was looking to do, as I was doing global strategy for a client, and they were on quite a nice growth trajectory. But the problem was that they were kind of evolving from let's call it a youth company or adolescent company to kind of a late teen, early adulthood kind of company. And the problem with a lot of successful, startups in general, but successful startup scale-ups, unicorns and so on, is that, especially for the startups, they can spend a lot of time running really, really fast without actually getting anywhere. Right.
Right.
As opposed to large companies that can be slow to move like glaciers, but that's a different thing.
Right.
But here we're dealing with something that clearly they've created a bit of momentum, but they're still a bit all over the place. And this was actually, I developed, and this will be in a new book, which should be available in a fine bookstore near you in a decently near future. But
yes.
So I've created something called the ABC framework, which is a strategic framework for adaptive strategy. And so this was the first time that I actually used it. And so what it does is it basically creates strategic boundaries. And instead of going the traditional route of saying, okay, so this is the line in the sand, we're all going to stand on it, it kind of like it draws two lines in the sand and goes, okay, so we cannot step outside of these, but within them, we can kind of move about so long as we move in the right direction at the right tempo. And anyway, so I started employing this, we built the strategy, and because they were still a sort of a company that was, again, doing a lot of money, they're doing really well, and everyone's kind of happy to try new stuff. It was very successful, and they made $5 billion in a year off of it.
Just a little feather in the cap there for JP.
Yeah, well, but I mean, it's anything like that. You're just part of a team. You're doing with other people. I mean, I was doing most of the work, but you bring people in, and not only that, but of course, there's a lot more happening in the world than just my strategy, but nonetheless, it was immensely successful.
I know.
It was yeah.
Well, but you're saying something also that I know people don't like that word, but there is luck, isn't there?
Yeah. I mean, you can kind of not create your own luck, but you can create let's call it the luck area, or you can create more opportunities for yourself. And that's absolutely doable, right? Yes, the cards still need to fall in the right place and need to put right cards and so on, but you can improve your metaphorical odds of success. It's entirely doable.
Well, then also I'm thinking like, yo, they did it. This big brand did it. We can do it. And you're like, you see, I have a funny story, because not only is that luck, but they created conditions that did those things. They set up parameters that, and you don't have that. And just like your aluminum can A company and B company, you're working with enterprise, you're working with small fish. Those things are going to collide, So I don't know.
Well, I mean, you still need to do the proper basics. I mean, you still need to ensure that you understand the business model. You need to ensure that at least at that moment you understand the business models of the competitors.
Right.
And you start with that, and then of course the ABCD. I remember once, I won't say who it was, but there's a famous marketing professor who was once asked about my work, and he said, it's all lovely, but it's fucking complicated. And what he meant was that the theory and the underlying science is quite advanced, and it can be difficult to sit through, especially if you're looking at complexity, because that stuff is properly difficult, some of it.
Yeah.
But actually working with it is really simple. It's kind of like those heuristics and rules of thumb that I mentioned. Whereas a lot of the conventional stuff, if you look at something like the McKinsey 7S model, for example, any executive looks at that and gets it immediately. It's very, very easy to understand in theory, so to speak, but actually employing it in practice is immensely difficult.
Yeah.
Because you just have one of in the McKinsey 7S thing, you have, okay, so strategy is one of the S's, and you go, okay, so what do we mean by strategy? Oh shit, that opens up a Pandora's box of potential
Worms,
problems.
snakes.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And then you go, okay, so what do we mean by structure? And then you get the same problem. And it's just layers upon layers upon layers upon layers. Of course, that's great if you're McKinsey, because you can sell consultancy services on top of it. But
in the complexity, there's margin.
Yeah. I mean, the only basic thing I've done is the 4E model, or market dynamics, which it's very simple, but it works, because what I've tried to do with that model specifically is I've tried to create something which is both sort of easy to get immediately and easy to work with. Of course, that creates certain limitations, but unlike McKinsey, I'm not doing it to sort of sell consultancy services. I'm just doing it because I like trying stuff out, and it has helped other clients. I created it for a client originally.
Yeah, that's amazing. And it's something that you experienced. I think a lot of people are taking things and not embodying or doing the work or putting your hands in. Like, I think like there's something that's unique about you, is because, yes, it is kind of high flying, and his newsletter is like up on that second, third, fourth shelf. But when it comes down, it's very simple. And that's what, I mean, I guess I just kind of wanted to get your like one piece of advice. Like, if somebody was looking, like, everything's changing, it's constantly changing, the world's changing, it's everything's been unprecedented for unprecedented amounts of times. How, like, what would be your one piece of advice to this person on how to navigate through this?
My one piece of advice would be to create resilience. And that essentially can be translated into the ability to adapt. It doesn't mean that you should run fast all the time if things are changing, but it means you need to develop the potential capacity to run fast if you need to. And the way to do that in practice, well, it depends on what we're sort of applying it to.
Right.
But for an individual, it's things like reading more broadly. Just don't read the same stuff. Anything on complexity is good, but it's just like, we'll read about complexity, biological systems, or history, or whatever interests you. And what you're going to realize is that when you have, it's what I suppose Charlie Munger called the lattice work upon which you hang your mental models, but you're going to have a larger understanding, a broader understanding of the world. And that allows you to create all these new connections. So when you encounter something, you can say essentially you can combine a bunch of narratives, understand what you're going to do, and then of course, I mean, you try to predict it in non-mathematical terms, try to anticipate, but you can kind of try to get a feel for where the world is heading. If you're an organization, I mean, I've done a lot of work in e-commerce over the years. So what would resilience look like for an e-commerce company, for example, right? Well, as James Hankins and I proved in our white paper from 2021 called The Gravity of E-commerce, essentially the higher penetration you have online, or if you own the fulfillment part, the lower your profitability is going to be, right? So how do we create resilience there? Well, we do other stuff that add margin to the overall puzzle. So if you look at Amazon, for example, take a cliched example. Yes, they have their e-com business, but that e-com business is losing a lot of money. So they do Amazon Web Services, and they do retail media, and they do this, that, and the other. And again, the way to do that is by starting small. Sort of
Mhm.
taking the conversation back to where we began.
Yeah.
Start small when you're trying these things out. And then if it works, if it shows promise, then you start building it. And over time, what's going to happen is you're going to create all of these new revenue streams that make the whole stronger. But not only that, it basically allows you to become or enables you to become resilient, so that if something does go sour, if you lose a revenue stream or whatever it might be, because something changes, a new law comes, a competitor does something or whatever it might be, then you have other legs to stand on, right? And that's the difference between robustness, this idea of being able to take a hit, which is the conventional idea, and the idea of resilience, which is the ability to sort of stand up again once you've been knocked down. All right, and you need both.
Man, so I have two things. One of them is, I think this resilience is the key to emotional. Like there's a lot of emotion. Everyone says it's business, isn't it personal? Well, why are y'all acting like personal assholes around this business stuff? You know, and so everyone's like, no, just passionate, it's just business. Oh my God, people get so passionate about business and then they get so emotive. How can you, but I'd imagine if you're following along at home with the media news cycle or the tech hype cycle or whatever kind of thing, you have to pre-wear one of those whiplash neck braces because your emotions are so tender. That resilience that you're talking about, that strategic understanding of curiosity, complexity, the difference in between robustness and resilience, could that help your emotions? I'm just like wondering, how does JP stay so chippy when he knows that like the future is chaos? Like, you know, it's like, but you're still super happy. You're making babies. You love life. Like how like navigating this complexity, how do you not wear it on your head?
Well, I suppose it does come back to that resilience, right? So if you look at how human beings make decisions, if you look at the latest theories, which are things like cognitive narrative theory, we encounter something. We try to interpret it. And the way that we interpret it is we use, as I mentioned, all these ideas and narratives. We try to make sense of what is happening. And then we apply a filter. And that filter is, to your point, emotional. And then we try to predict things. But the thing is, from my experience, and I'm not sure whether this translates to anyone else, but the more I enjoy the process of learning stuff, full stop. And so when I learn about stuff, when I read broadly, I get a broader perspective. So I don't get as agitated about these things that I perhaps used to get in the past when I just knew the one thing. It allows you know, if you understand various cultures, for example, you might understand someone else's perspective. And sometimes, you know, for example, I have an acquaintance who also works in the field of complexity. And one of the problems so he was dealing with a very real, very serious problem. I'm not talking about businesses here, but actually fractions between religious groups. I think it might have been in Northern Ireland. But essentially people who've grown up to hate each other. So what they did was they took a bunch of people from each group and they flew them to South America, just took them completely into a new context. And over a couple of weeks, they were sort of given tasks that they needed to solve and things they need to do and this, that, and the other. But it had nothing to do with the religion. They could not talk about the religion. They were just essentially engaging. And over time, they start understanding the other side. And once they understood the other side, then they can start talking about resilience. Then I suppose it's empathy in a sense, right? But understanding where the other person comes from can do wonders. That's the thing. I mean, I'm not known for suffering fools gladly. I know that.
No, he is not.
But I kind of, I get a lot of time, I get where people are coming from. And it's not that they're morons. It's just that they haven't read a lot, typically.
Well, that's the kindest thing I think you've said this interview. It's not that you're dumb. You just haven't read the right books, and God bless you. Go. No, but the way you share what you learned, the passion for but for real, I'm not playing, man. Like, I mean, honestly, you have a passion because it comes from this learning, but I want to share this with you. And I think some of the best minds that are out here, some of the most helpful people are working at a very high clip intellectually, but they don't have a problem coming down here to where the thick morass of the general class is. And helping us kind of explain things and see different ways. And I mean, this whole freaking interview has been a masterclass. But this last thing, this seems like if there's somebody, and maybe I'm speaking personally, or maybe, just seeing how it is, there's one person that's going to be tasked with decomplexifying things. There's one person that's going to get the strategy thing. There's one person.
Yeah.
But that isn't how it works. The way you just described your work is you get people in a group. Or your way you describe that South American thing, you get them away from the context. How important is communication and teamwork? I mean, because it does take a person with the intellectual curiosity and capacity to go and fix these problems, identify them properly, and come back. But you have to make everybody spin. And so just one more little thing on why it isn't just one person who wants to learn a bunch of stuff. You know what I mean?
But I mean, it's good to have someone like that who's in the room.
You have to have a champion, right? Yeah.
Yeah, but for example, right, if you're talking about team build or how do you utilize teams, right?
Right.
Well, I mean, there are a bunch of ways in which one can utilize teams and create diversity in a group, or how one can use various constraints to create outcomes that won't be achievable if they weren't there. So to give a practical example, if you're looking to solve a problem, come up with ideas, for example, for innovation, instead of just having a bunch of people from the same kind of, socioeconomic backgrounds and who have read the same books and gone to the same university. Well, get someone in from finance, get someone who's a senior, get someone who's from a marketing department, get someone who has a degree in the arts, for example, and get someone in who hasn't worked for the company for more than 6 months, so that they're actually not yet quote unquote biased, right? And then if you have a person in that room who knows how to create those kinds of teams and constraints and how you apply that over skill and what kind of problems that you want to solve and how you do that, then you can do wonders. And the problem with a lot of the conventional stuff, it kind of boils down to just get the best people in a room.
Right.
And the problem is a lot of time those people have the very same view of the world. And that means basically they're just going to come up with the one solution. Sometimes that works, but oftentimes it doesn't. And that's a huge thing.
Yeah. Huge.
But there's a real business case of diversity beyond the save the world kind of purpose.
Yeah, that's what I was just thinking. It's unfortunate that took such a left turn, and then people failed to see it through because of these constraints that you said, well, I know it'd be nice to get some different kind of voices, but my boys over here know what they talk about, and you're like, they know what you think you want to know, what you want to hear, which is different than the truth or different than information. So, I mean, dude, we could go off, but we can't because you have a life. People are listening to this. They need lunch. Man, you have been amazing. Thank you so much for spending your time with me. If people want to connect with you, and they do, how can they do that online, JP?
These days, easiest to find me on LinkedIn probably, or my website, jpcastlin.com. Obviously, you have your the newsletter, strategyandpractices.substack.com. That's also easiest, but LinkedIn is the easiest way to find me, I suppose. And on a final practical note, just to sort of summarize that thing about constraints and whatever else, always remember that constraints can also be enabling. So if you have a hose pipe, let's say, right, and you have a stone in that thing, the usual theory or hypothesis is just you remove that pebble or stone in order to create more flow. But actually, if you put it to one side, you can steer the water to the other side and create a higher flow. There are a lot of things you can do with constraints, and if you know what to do and how to use them, Jesus Christ, it opens up our possibilities and opportunities.
Cheese or chocolate?
Are you ready?
Yes, sir.
Cheese or chocolate?
Depends on the cheese, but I'll go with cheese, broadly speaking.
I keep forgetting I'm talking to Mr. Complexity himself.
No. You're talking about to a European in this case.
Oh, which is double problems. We just walked into
so
it.
I'm gonna say cheese.
All right. Fair.
Right.
Plato the philosopher or Plato the Play-Doh?
The Play-Doh, having small children.
Yeah, there's much more stuff you could do with that.
Yes,
Like a rock or like a reed?
Read.
Nice. All right. Bending in the wind, but strong underneath. Walk on a beach or hike a mountain?
Hike a mountain every single day.
Totally. Fully know the future or fully know the past?
Fully know the past.
That's a safe bet. And then finally,
I like historians. I don't like futurists.
yes, absolutely. If I had to choose one of those people to hang out and have a beer with, it'd be the historian. And not some future beer where I have to drink it through a Bitcoin bit mug. Okay. And this is the last one, and I saved it because I knew it would be contentious. Francis Bacon or Bacon in France?
That's a good one. I'm going to go with Francis Bacon because bacon in France is not very good from my experience. French. I've lived in France. I love French people, even though they can be kind of French somewhere, but sometimes. But Jesus Christ, you cannot do bacon.
The truth is coming out here at the end of this amazing episode. Sorry, France.
No, I mean, I was raised in a French kitchen. Again, I've lived in France. I do 99.9% of all the food at home. I love cooking, and almost all of it is French. So again, I'm a huge fan of French cuisine, but bacon does not translate from my experience. It just doesn't.
Sorry.
Wah, wah, wah.
Wah,
Sorry,
wah, wah. Sorry, France.
What Gets Measured is a NinjaCat podcast. Please rate and review the show wherever you find your podcasts. Share this episode on social. And visit us on the web at ninjacat.io.